good afternoon in UK, good morning in US, and good evening in East Asia, and good late afternoon in India. We have with us today on the CG webinar, which is officially speaking CG seminar number 217, Amal Kumar from Harvard, from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. But before I introduce him properly, let me take you through the webinar protocols. Remember that the webinar is being recorded so that all your amazing statements and questions will be on YouTube within 48 hours or so, and you'll be able to reach that connection through our CG website. We also post a transcript of the chat function as well. Now, please keep yourself muted during the webinar unless you're about to speak. There's no need to have your video on either during the webinar, but again, we'd like you to turn it on when you come into the webinar and ask a question or make a statement. We recommend using speaker view in Zoom, which you can see that setting that's in top right, so you can more clearly see who is talking at any given time. Now, to ask a question, and we do encourage you to develop questions, use the chat function, put your question or your preferred statement into chat, and I will select you into the webinar in a sequence that I determine from there. Normally speaking, if you come in early, you should become part of the Q&A discussion, which is an important part of our webinar. If you pop into the chat quite late in the webinar, in the last 5 minutes or so, there's a good chance your question won't figure in the final wash up. So I do advise you to type out your question or your statement in the chat pretty well soon after our speaker has finished speaking. That's the optimum time. When you're invited to ask the question, and I'll give you a warning in the chat beforehand, please unmute yourself, switch on your video, and begin by stating your name and where you are from, and then say what you want to say. Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome Amal Kumar for the first time to the CG webinar. Amal, we have these webinars twice a week. They're global webinars, and we've got a history of strong coverage in terms of participation from across the world. We tend to get better coverage because of the time zones in UK, India, Southeast Asia, East Asia than we do in the United States. But the East Coast is usually within our time zone, but California, unfortunately, usually too early, and middle of the country likewise struggles to get in. But you know, you're in the right part of the country if you're in Harvard at the moment. So if you're in Boston, so that should work out for you. Are you in Boston at the moment?
No, it's actually just about 6 a.m. here in California, where I live.
You're a poor presenter. That's shocking. I'm sorry to inflict this demand on you. I didn't realize that was the case, but we're very grateful to you for either staying up all night or getting up early in the morning, as the case may be, and giving us your paper. Now, Amal is a postdoc fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. His research is at the intersection of higher education governance and organizational theory studies. He's interested in the agency of organizational actors within normative and regulatory constraints of policy structures. I think a lot of us are interested in this kind of broad area. So it'd be interesting to see what you're doing with theory and method. But I understand that you're interested in the Californian system. Some of us have worked on it. It's a really important system worldwide. It's had a huge impact on the rest of the world. It's stratified form, the California model, and you know, particularly because of the health and strength of its different components. Though we're all worried about community colleges at the moment, but you'll be able to tell us primarily about the state university sector and academic drift. So at this point, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Simon. I hope everyone can see my screen. Simon, if I could just get a thumbs up from you if it's all good.
It's all there.
So it's, as I said, it's just after 6 a.m. Forgive me if I'm a little bleary-eyed, but I should start by introducing myself. So I'm Amal Kumar. As Simon said, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Collaborative on Academic Careers in Higher Education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I'm also an affiliated researcher with the UC Berkeley Center for Studies in Higher Education. What I'm going to talk through today is a case study, as Simon said, of the origins and evolution of academic drift within the state university system over this 45-year period. And through this case study, I'm trying to challenge certain assumptions in the literature about why academic drift happens and how it evolves and develops over time. So I'll first situate this work within sort of broader research interests so you have a sense of where I'm coming from. And then we'll walk through the concept of academic drift, summarize debates in the literature, empirical approach, findings, importance, implications, and so forth. This should leave us enough time for feedback and some good discussion at the end. So at a very high level, my research interests lie at this intersection of public higher education, organizational sociology, and qualitative and case study methods. Within this interdisciplinary focus, I really try to illuminate the agency of organizational staff and leaders within these broader regulatory and normative structures created by higher education policy. In particular, my recent research has focused on this concept of organizational identity as a key factor in explaining the evolution of developments in higher ed governance, such as academic drift, which I'm going to talk about today. So that should give you sort of a sense of how I would be approaching the concepts I'll discuss today. All right, so academic drift. Academic drift has been a central concept in higher education scholarship for pretty much the last half century, although exactly how it has been studied has varied by disciplinary context. There's also some differences in terminology between European and American scholars. So this phenomenon has sort of variously been called mission drift, mission creep, and striving, but really these terms refer to the same phenomenon. To understand this phenomenon, we have to first develop the concept of an organizational field and explore what that means, what it means for higher education to be a field. So a field comprises a group of institutions that are bounded by some set of shared norms, regulations, or practices. So in this graphic here, we can imagine higher education as a bounded field within the circle. Within this field, there is a variety of organizational types: public universities, privates, polytechnics, community colleges, for-profits, and so forth. Some organizations are elite and high up on the prestige ladder, so think Oxford, Harvard, Yale, so forth, while others are considered less prestigious. Both elite and non-elite universities in this field are bound by sort of some shared set of norms and regulations, so think academic freedom, tenure, and so forth. Right. So academic drift, taking this idea of the field, then academic drift traces its roots to the work of British sociologists Tyrell Burgess and John Pratt in the 1970s, who found that non-degree polytechnic schools in the UK had drifted over time away from technical education and towards higher status academic and disciplinary instruction. Over the ensuing decades, academic drift then has been conceptualized as the phenomena by which, over time, motivated by the pursuit of prestige, lower status colleges and universities adopt the forms and practices of the more elite ones. So by changing their names, increasing research outputs, starting graduate and doctoral programs, and so forth. This has the effect, as you can see in this figure here, of increasing organizational homogeneity. So over time, all colleges begin to look like the elites. So until about the mid-2000s, the general consensus was that higher education was a single field like this, and that within this field, the informed view remained that in the medium to longer term, academic drift was inevitable. The elites set some norms or practices, the less elite institutions mimic those in an attempt to gain prestige or status. This leads to homogeneity. The elites, in turn, move the goalposts a little more, and this kind of process sort of inevitably continues. But more recent scholarship has called into question this inevitability hypothesis by arguing that higher education is not one field, but an institutionally plural field. That is, instead of universities, community colleges, publics, and privates all operating in one field, there are actually multiple and potentially overlapping fields, and institutions play in one or more than one of these fields. So rather than having one field with a single set of norms and practices and one group of elites, each of these fields is governed by its own set of logics and by its own set of elites. When framed this way, not only are institutions ordered within fields by prestige, but the fields themselves are also ordered by prestige. So for example, what used to be the field of higher education is now a field of polytechnics, a field of universities, a field of public universities, a field of private universities, and so forth. And these are sort of ordered both sort of intersectingly and by increasing prestige. Now, academic drift becomes not so much a process of homogenization within a field, but more of a strategic decision to exit a less prestigious field for a more prestigious field. So we can reframe then academic drift as the process by which universities adopt the symbolic and substantive forms that allow them to move from a low status field to a higher status field. This reconceptualization is really important. So recent research has suggested that institutions that are closer to field boundaries may be more likely to be tempted by prestige and exit the field because they're less embedded in the norms and less captive to the regulations. On the other hand, organizations that are more central to the field, like this one all the way here on the left-hand side, they may be more likely to be penalized for trying to break those norms, so they're less likely to attempt it. This conceptualization squares with recent findings in the United States that, for example, some regional public universities have actually engaged in actions that more deeply embed them in relatively lower prestige, urban serving institutional fields. So academic drift now is no longer inevitable as a phenomenon. We're not all doomed to look like Harvard, Stanford, or Oxford one day. And while we've learned a lot about academic drift over the past few decades, there's still some important unanswered questions. First, we actually don't know much about how these actions are contested by other universities within the origin or destination fields, and by the policy or regulatory agencies in the field. So the influence of other actors in the field is quite relevant for public universities in particular in the United States, because their missions and range of activities are often prescribed in statute. But also public universities are often organized as multi-campus systems governed by a single board, which makes it impossible for any one campus to unilaterally start a new program or change a name. So it's likely that the institutional policy and regulatory contexts in which academic drift happens plays a role in explaining its dynamics and outcomes over time. And this context has been so far under-theorized in the literature. The other unanswered question, and this is more of an assumption, is whether the desire for greater prestige is the only strategic motive for academic drift, whether prestige is really to higher education what profit is to corporations. The literature that I've sort of walked through above has without exception assumed that universities change their names or start new degree programs because they want to acquire greater prestige. But this assumption doesn't square with those recent findings I talked about, by which where universities have engaged in strategic actions to more deeply embed them in less prestigious fields. So if the pursuit of prestige is not always the end goal, then what other explanations might exist for academic drift? So I address these two questions through an interpretive case study of academic drift within the California State University system between 1960 and 2005. By interpretive case study, I mean that this paper investigates a particular phenomenon, origins and evolution of academic drift, in a particular context, the California State University system, over a defined period of time, this 45-year period that you see here. And the goal really is to interpret or theorize about the phenomenon itself. By interpretive, I mean that methodologically, this study takes the form of archival interpretations of archival primary and secondary source documents, although I do supplement these with original interviews that I conducted with key policy actors. Before I get to the actual story of academic drift, I'd like to spend a couple of minutes just talking through these sources. The most important archival sources included the California State Archives and the California State University Archives. I also drew from documents archived on the website of the California Post-Secondary Education Commission and newspapers archived within ProQuest and the California Digital Newspaper Collection. These documentary sources allowed me to establish a meta-history of the CSU system and identify critical junctures, key protagonists, and so forth. I then supplemented these archival materials with both archived oral history interviews and original oral history interviews that I conducted with 21 higher education stakeholders through 2020, all sort of virtual over Zoom. The archived oral histories and my own interviews illuminated participants' lived experiences and their subjective motivations. So for my own interviews, I grew the interview list through a process of snowball sampling. I stopped the interviews when I reached theoretical saturation or when information from additional interviews effectively became redundant to what I had already learned. In the interest of time, I'm not going to dwell on the methodological aspects, but I'm happy to discuss more about my sources or the interpretive approach in the Q&A. In the next few slides, I'm going to take us through the history and evolution of academic drift in the state university system. But before I do, I'm just going to summarize the main argument and the main contributions. So in 1960, the California Master Plan granted the University of California system the exclusive authority to award the doctoral degree. But it allowed the CSU system the ability to award master's degrees and so-called joint doctorates in partnership with the University of California. In doing so, it created a crisis of organizational identity within the CSU system. This identity threat manifested as a sense of inequity among CSU system faculty and leadership, who then sought to resolve this threat by gaining recognition of an organizational identity, that of a sophisticated university, that they felt they were inhabiting as a matter of daily practice. As faculty and leaders within the system made efforts to rectify this inequity over the course of 40 years, they encountered opposition at various times from the legislature, the governor, the UC system, and other stakeholders. But ultimately, CSU was able to prevail in the legislature, obtaining in 1972 the right to the university title, and then in 2005, the right to independently award doctoral degrees in education. In making this argument, I make two contributions to the literature on academic drift. First, I demonstrate that the motivation to engage in academic drift comes not from a pursuit of prestige, but rather from a foundational threat to CSU's organizational identity. So the origins of academic drift then come from a need for recognition of an identity that faculty and leaders held, but that was not shared by outside stakeholders. The second contribution is to demonstrate how academic drift is contested by other stakeholders in the university's fields. So in describing the evolution of academic drift then, I characterize it as a temporal and contested phenomenon, a political phenomenon even, that necessitates historical explanation. The rest of the presentation will sort of unfold as follows. I'll walk us through the periodization of academic drift, which I've divided into three distinct historical periods. The first, from 1960 to about 72, centers on the system's efforts to change its name from the California State Colleges to the California State University. The second, from about 72 through the 1990s, focused on the system's unsuccessful push to gain that legislative authority for the education doctorate. And the final period, from about 98 to 2005, which did culminate in CSU gaining that authority to independently award the education doctorate. In the next few slides, I'll talk through sort of each of these periods in turn. So when the California Master Plan for Higher Education was being negotiated in 1959, it was among the first of such plans in the country to seek a rational approach to governing its higher education system. The master plan sought to divide higher education into the UC system, so UC Berkeley, UCLA, and so forth, as the state's research universities. It envisioned the California State Colleges, which later became the CSU system, as we'll see, as the undergraduate teaching institutions. And the third and the largest segment of higher education was the community college system, intended to be open access and the entryway to upper division courses. Negotiations, however, about how to structure and govern the system almost broke down in 1959 because representatives of the state colleges insisted that any final agreement include approval for their faculty to award doctoral degrees and for the state to fund faculty research at the state colleges. This, of course, was unacceptable to the UC folks who wanted to retain their monopoly over doctoral education, the crown, what they considered the crown jewel of the academy. The final plan that got legislated acknowledged that the UC system was the primary state-supported academic agency for research, and that it had the sole authority to award doctoral degrees. But it did create an exception, that the state colleges could partner with the UCs to jointly award doctoral degrees under the UC banner. Simultaneously, the Act institutionalized the state colleges as the institution for, and I quote here, the provision of instruction of undergraduate students and graduate students through the master's degrees. And it also limited faculty research to only what was consistent with this primary function of undergraduate and graduate instruction. So this undergraduate and graduate mission and the ability to jointly award doctoral degrees created somewhat of a dissonance within faculty and leaders at the state colleges. If the state colleges could provide graduate instruction, if their faculty could do research consistent with the mission, and if their faculty could award joint doctoral degrees, then in what way were they not a university? And if they were functionally a university, then why was their faculty's ability to do research limited? And why weren't they called a university? This dissonance manifested as a sense of inequity. In 1966, for example, a report released by the Academic Senate complained that the state colleges had been placed, and I quote, in a perpetually and invidiously subordinate position to the university, and that there was, quote, differential and subordinate treatment of the state colleges despite their nearly identical functions when compared to the UC system. By the late 1960s, state college leaders began mobilizing legislative support and sponsoring legislation trying to authorize a name change from the state colleges to the state university. This proposal generated significant opposition from other stakeholders, both in government and presumably as expected from the UC system. But by 1971, despite this opposition and given really the symbolic nature of this change and growing legislative support, the legislature passed and Governor Ronald Reagan signed a law allowing state college campuses to assume that university title on a case-by-case basis if they met certain criteria. And the California State University system was born. With the symbolic issue of the university name decided, CSU leaders now turned their attention towards the issue of the doctoral degrees. Now, these joint doctorates had generally been underperforming. Between 1970 and 1980, for example, the UC and CSU systems jointly awarded just 58 doctoral degrees jointly, fewer than 5 a year across all fields. In fact, by 1981, the Legislative Analyst's Office in California recommended the elimination of these programs, noting, and I quote, "We must seriously question whether the program serves any meaningful purpose in enhancing the system's educational status." This precariousness was enough to get new CSU Chancellor Ann Reynolds, who had been appointed in 1982, to call for CSU to be given the authority to independently award doctoral degrees, especially in applied fields such as education. Importantly, Reynolds was careful to emphasize that this was not about the pursuit of prestige, right? We are not trying to move into the area of doctoral research. We are not research universities. We do not aspire to be. Privately, she emphasized that this move was actually a continuation of CSU's current identity. I'm just really sorry. I still think that being able to offer a doctorate is a normal function of any complicated university, any sophisticated university, which CSU is. Awarding the doctorate was just recognition of an identity that CSU leaders felt that they already inhabited. Yet this proposal met with significant opposition, not just from the UC system, but also from the state's independent higher education coordinating agency, which noted that there was no compelling evidence for demand for doctoral degrees in education, that no new doctoral programs be established, i.e. at the CSUs. And although there was some negotiation between Reynolds and the UC president, David Gardner, at the time, to try to explore an expansion of these joint doctorates, this effort by CSU to gain that recognition for their complicated and sophisticated identity failed in that short term. The next and ultimately successful push for this recognition came during the turn of the millennium under the leadership of Chancellor Charles Reed. So Reed was a savvy political operator. He had developed a strong friendship with a state senator, Jack Scott, who was a champion of the community colleges and really an advocate in the legislature for expanding the scale of education doctorates in California. Reed and Scott made common cause, and in 1999, the state passed a bill sponsored by Scott asking for a study of the education doctorate in California. But really what it was doing was trying to lay the groundwork to legislatively award the doctorate in education to the Cal State system. But this study that they called for, which was again conducted by the California Post-Secondary Education Commission, reached the same conclusion as they had 13 years ago. Overall supply meets overall demand, and that no new doctoral degrees are needed in the state. But this time, the CSU system was ready with a rebuttal. The Chancellor's office had sponsored its own study of supply and demand for education doctorates, which concluded just a few months later that the state's demand and supply had been artificially suppressed, and that future demand would be higher than future supply. The only way to rectify this future problems, the report argued, was to allow the CSU system to award the EDD degree, the doctorate in education, independently. As they had done in the past, the UCs mobilized to oppose this latest push for CSU to gain, again, that recognition of their university identity. So Clark Kerr, the architect of the master plan, 90 years old by now, but still holding a considerable intellectual sway in California, wrote a letter to the legislature in which he was quite apocalyptic about what might happen if CSU were given the authority to award the doctorate. He said, approval of an independent CSU doctorate would be a major example of mission creep. Once set in motion, mission creep is nearly impossible to reverse. It has cost taxpayers in most states millions of dollars because it has generated unproductive competition, overbuilding, and duplication of effort in public higher education systems around the country. But in 2001, which is when he sort of wrote this letter, the politics weren't right for the UCs. There was some support in the legislature to give the CSU system, the politics weren't right for the CSU system. There was some support in the legislature to grant the authority to independently award education doctorates, but there wasn't support in the governor's office. Governor Gray Davis had warm relations with the UC president at the time, had made it clear that he would veto any enabling legislation if it made it to his desk. But just a couple of years later, the political circumstances shifted. By 2003, there was a new UC president, a new governor in California, and Clark Kerr had passed away. But most importantly, the veto threat was gone. So in 2004, when the National Accrediting Board for Audiologists changed the field's certification requirements to require the Doctor of Audiology degree, the CSU leadership saw their chance. So in Feb 2005, Jack Scott introduces a bill allowing the CSU system to independently award professional and clinical doctoral degrees. This is a broader mandate than the CSU system had asked for a few years ago, but it leveraged this ostensive rationale of the change in accrediting requirements for professional audiologists, right, from a master's in audiology to a doctorate in audiology. And although the UC system tried to fight it, the argument against this was hard, as a UC government relations person told me in our interview. People said, well, why do you care so much about audiology? It's just a little thing, it's a little topic over here. Your people haven't really been all that interested in this anyway. They won't do it. The UC faculty weren't interested in it. Why are you so against it? It was a difficult argument to make as to why they should not be able to do this. And over the next few months, as UC lobbied against the bill and legislative negotiations sort of went on, the scope of that bill narrowed from professional and clinical degrees to just the doctorate in education. This effectively discarded audiology as that ostensive rationale for making the change to the master plan. But as another government relations executive told me, that was just a pure read of the votes and the politics. Members of the committee were persuaded about the K-12 and community college need. Audiology was not as prevalent in their mind. And it was Jack Scott and Charlie Reed that we needed to focus on education. Eventually, in September 2005, 45 years after they had first sought recognition of their status as a full university, right, as that complicated and sophisticated university, as one that granted doctoral degrees, the master plan was amended and the CSU system was given that authority. It was able to independently award doctoral degrees in education. Okay, so zooming back out for a bit. Remember this slide? This is a slide from earlier in the presentation where I talked about the research showing how academic drift was a move, a strategic change from one field to another in the pursuit of prestige. Well, the case that I've just walked through calls that assumption into question. In fact, I suggest here that CSU was not so much moving from one field to another field, as much as it wanted recognition for an identity, the who we think we are, that it already held. There was no movement between fields for CSU. Right from 1960, they always thought they existed in that middle circle. It's just that others didn't recognize that. And this gap between who we think we are and who they think we are, fueled that desire for recognition. The recognition first to get the university name, and then to get recognition for doctoral instruction that had already been happening through the joint doctorates since 1960. This gap, as I said, between who we think we are and who you think we are, is what's known in the organizational literature as an identity threat. And it has not so far been considered as an explanation motivating academic drift as a phenomenon. So the first contribution of this work is really to challenge the assumption that the pursuit of prestige is the sole motivator for academic drift, and that academic drift involves a move from a less prestigious field to a more prestigious field. The second contribution of this paper is to show that academic drift is a contested and political process. The path from decision to adoption is historically contingent, it's nonlinear, and it's far from inevitable. Right? CSU's authority to grant the education doctorate was attained only because of a confluence of a political transition in the governor's office, the death of an influential higher education statesman in Clark Kerr, a leadership transition within the UC system, and a change to the accreditation requirements for audiologists. But that doesn't mean that the past 40 years of attempts were irrelevant. In fact, they built the foundation from which CSU mounted that ultimately successful event. Each time that CSU mounted an effort to gain that authority to award the doctoral degree, the UC system presented the same defense, that such an action would violate the state's master plan. Yet, was the influence of the California Master Plan for Higher Education same in 2005 as it was in 1965? Would the window of opportunity that opened in 2005 have opened 40 years earlier? Would legislators have been open to making an exception to a plan so recently negotiated? This finding suggests that as a phenomenon, academic drift might be able to be processually disaggregated into constituent parts, which are then realized over a period of time. For example, it's telling that the CSU system first sought the name change, which was symbolic, and then pursued the doctoral degree, which was more substantive. This was a strategic decision and a sequenced one, right? Even within the doctoral degree, the choice of the doctorate in education versus audiology was a strategic one. In fact, in 2005 or after 2005, when the doctorate in education bill passed, several audiology programs within the CSU system had to shut down because their programs were no longer accredited by the national board because they weren't offering doctoral degrees in audiology. So this idea of having academic drift being sequenced and strategic is really important. And to the extent that future research on this topic adopts this kind of longitudinal case study approach, it might be worthwhile to attend to issues of chronology and contingency, both in methodology and concept definition. I'm gonna stop here. This concludes the talk. I'm gonna leave my email address on the slide. Please email me if you have any questions or if you want to chat about anything I've talked about today. I'd love to hear any questions at this point that you might have for me or feedback you might have that could strengthen this work. thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you, Amal. I think you've opened up in a very clear manner this whole discussion in California. And I mean, I've got a couple of questions to raise with you first, and there's some people coming through in the chat already. I mean, the original settlement, the sort of 1960 master plan settlement, was always going to be vulnerable along in this area. And I mean, it wasn't so apparent in 1960 when California's level of participation was very high in world terms. No longer the case today to quite the same extent. But in those days, only a relatively small proportion of the state's young people entered into doctoral universities, fully fledged doctoral universities offering the full range of research functions and so on in the University of California system, with the CSUs largely cut out of that role. Now, as higher education has evolved around the world, in many countries, the majority of higher education students are entering institutions, universities, designated universities, where doctoral degrees are offered across the broad range of disciplines and where the research function is normalized. And yet in California, you've got what percentage of people, school leavers, go to University of California? What, 15%, less, 12.5%?
It's lower than that. It's about 13% of the top of the high school graduates are guaranteed, but really it doesn't quite work out that way in practice because the admissions, particularly at Berkeley and UCLA and so forth, are much more selective than that. So it's actually a lower share. I believe it's sort of on the order of 9 or 10%.
Yeah, well, it's only 1 in 10. So you've got a relatively low proportion of young people having access to that kind of higher education with the full range of science disciplines and the full range of doctoral education and so on, and funded research as part of those activities. So always the potential was there to turn the CSUs into fully fledged research universities. And it's been such a long struggle. When you read the Clark-Kerr papers, it's fairly clear that they saw this as naked self-interest, that it was really essential to hold off to keep the research budget in the University of California system, to prevent the rivers of gold from flowing to any, being diluted by flowing anywhere else. But arguably not a solution in the long-term interest of the state or the young people of the state. But why has it taken so long, do you think, to change that? Well, the original master plan had tremendous normative power, didn't it?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question, Simon, and thank you for that. I think I have 3 different ways of thinking about this, actually. The first, as you rightly point out, is the normative power of the master plan, although I would argue that some of that is beginning to wane. Certainly in the early years, over the first, I would say, sort of 2 decades, the master plan held almost stone tablet status in California, right, where its principles were inviolable. In fact, maybe even longer than that. Every 10 years, the legislature sort of put together these review committees and review commissions for the master plan, which started off with, the way that the master plan, California higher education is not working in the way that we want it to, sort of preparation, access is not quite where we want to be, inequities are rife and so forth, but we reaffirm the ideals and tenets of the master plan. And I think some of those are beginning to be called into question. So the normative, I think the normative power of the master plan is definitely one. I think the other part of it, really, that explains why it took so long to change, is the UC systems have a lot of political power, right? And because they have sort of constitutional autonomy as per the California Constitution, whereas the state colleges are written in statute, the state colleges really needed to sort of marshal a political coalition to make even minor changes to their statutory authority, which they did. And in fact, this doctorate in education, as sort of one I learned in my interviews, one person told me, it really wasn't about education. The idea is to get the camel's nose under the tent, as it were, right, and then begin to expand out from there. And then I really do think, I think the third part of why it's taken so long is, again, sort of broader contextual conversations, as you say, about sort of massification and some of the neoliberal pressures in higher education, which call for discourses of efficiency and effectiveness, right? And what's really interesting, one of the dynamics that's really interesting here is CSU always framed its push in terms of equity, right? We've been placed in a subordinate position. This is invidious and so forth. And the UCs always frame their response in terms of efficiency, right? This is a waste of money. It's going to result in needless duplication. We can expand the joint doctorates much more efficiently. And so I think this sort of dominance of this efficiency discourse is another sort of reason why it ended up taking so long, because pushing back against some of those macro pressures is hard. So I think of it sort of in those as sort of a three-way story that's interacting with each other, if that sort of makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, you could argue that the master plan sort of began to fall over at the point where universal access was no longer guaranteed. I mean, that was a tremendous promise in the 1960s to offer everyone higher education through the two-year colleges mostly. And once that two-year colleges and the state system, university system was no longer as accessible, you could say the master plan wasn't delivering on the access promise. I mean, at that point, probably a new master plan was needed, you would think, to, one which was viable in budgetary terms and fulfill the original objectives of creating both access and excellence. But there hasn't been a new master plan, really, has there? I mean, do you think California needs one now? Needs to rethink?
Yeah, so I preface by saying I think one other reason is that we have to look at the demographics of which students attend which universities. So California higher education is still reasonably segregated when you look at sort of the demographics of the kinds of students who attend the UCs and the kinds who attend the CSU systems. And frankly, and this is sort of beyond just education in the United States, but getting the legislature to care about minority students and sort of whether or not they should or shouldn't have access to things like doctoral education has been somewhat of a challenge, right? And so the UCs have sort of been able to get that lion's share of the interest, if nothing else. On the topic of a new master plan, there's always debate about, does California need a new master plan? And I wonder about sort of if we are past the point of master planning as a way of handling, sort of as a way of planning for university growth. It's, in my mind, for example, an open question whether the UC system is still public in the same way that it was in 1960, right? Whether it even considers itself a public university. I know there have been sort of proposals floated off and on over the past 50 years to make UC Berkeley and UCLA, in fact, nonprofit, sort of private nonprofit universities, and take them out of the public domain entirely. So I think a new paradigm is certainly needed, and a way of thinking about sort of access and how the state will ensure indeed universal access to not just a higher education, but to a quality higher education. And we're beginning to get some part of the way there by blurring some of these strong boundaries between the systems, right? Through the doctorate, through community college bachelor's degrees and so forth, beginning to blur some of these distinctions. And maybe that sort of begin to blur those distinctions might be a way to go, rather than to sort of embark on another sort of 2-year, legislative committee master planning process. I just don't know how politically feasible that would be in, 2021 as it was in 1960.
The politics in 58, 59 were agonizing enough. I wouldn't like to see them now.
Right.
Now we've got a run of people wanting to talk with you. Martin Dole is our first Q&A participant. Martin, please come in.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Amal, for a really interesting presentation and stimulated a few thoughts from my point of view in comparison with the English condition. My first English experience, my first point was actually the term drift normally implies unconscious movement, which is what I more would recognize in the English case, but in your case study, the change appears to have occurred of deliberative actions, so more properly called creep. But I think the latter exchange you just had with Simon around the master plan implies that there was a normative process that you had to fight against in order to have the deliberative action towards a drift towards similarity of mission and approach. We didn't have that master plan, don't have the master plan in the UK, so that relates, I think, to your second part of your conversation with Simon, is in the absence of a master plan, do you think it's possible for institutions to retain differentiated functions and identity in this evolving situation? And in that respect, I'm thinking of some of the continental systems where there seem to be different definitions of prestige in dual systems. So you have technical universities, applied universities in Singapore and in Germany, which don't seem to be directed in quite the same way as towards a mimetic drift towards academic achievement in a doctoral form as being the recognized form of prestige and achievement.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I think that's absolutely right. So, and in fact, there's evidence from other states, even within the United States. This was sort of what I was saying about how some of what we call regional comprehensive universities, which are usually master's level public universities that exist in less elite fields, they've actually sort of been shown to take strategic actions to more deeply embed themselves in what I think folks are calling sort of fields of equity, right? Rather than fields of academia or fields of prestige. And I think your idea of sort of having different definitions of prestige is an interesting one, right? And so we can, one way that's making me think is, is academic drift then, as you say, or not quite academic drift, but is drift or creep, right, as a macro phenomenon inevitable? It's just what we are drifting towards or what we're creeping towards, changing in different contexts. So to your point, and I'd love to sort of ask you, given your sort of experiences in the English context or continental context, even within these technical universities or other forms, is there drift towards some sort of eliteness within that particular constraint? I can speak to what's in California, but
I think Simon and others would be better qualified, I think, than me to speak about this, but actually the regulatory requirements for funding and allocation of funding drives behavior and implies prestige and therefore drives the issue. One of the things I did point to in my other part of my question was Richard Rummout's work around good strategy and bad strategy, and good strategy defining what you won't do as much as what you will do, and therefore defining identity in that manner. And many university strategies I've looked at are so open-ended as to allow for the drift towards where regulators would take it in terms of funding opportunities, rather than a deliberative action about saying what we are good at and what we choose to do, which is different to others.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, Martin. And what's happened in the UK is almost the opposite, Amal, of what happened in California. I mean, there are many ways to create and sustain a hierarchy, let me say, and that's often the bottom line, isn't it?
Yeah.
The established interests are protected in the outcome one way or another. And in the UK, we say to the universities, not to the other institutions, but the universities, you're all expected to be research universities if you want prestige and live up to the title. You're all expected to recruit international students on that basis. You're all expected to imitate the mission of the University College London or other great research universities who've got tremendous resources and status within the system. And so you've got this hierarchy with everyone nominally pursuing the same mission, and it's very, nonetheless, very stratified. And that's, of course, the opposite of saying, okay, you're all got to take your allocated roles. You're allowed to do everything. You're only allowed to do some things, and you're only allowed to do a few things. But the outcome's the same, isn't it? You get this prestige hierarchy, resource hierarchy, and behavior follows. So yes,
I like the term mimetic drift, actually, rather than academic drift. It's a drift to a similarity.
Yes, it's tremendous. And so you've got this, university leaders in what were the polys, many of them anyway, not all, but many are pursuing this mission, knowing that they can't compete effectively, but are having to do it anyway. And it's a hiding to nothing. It's a very difficult situation, and they make a pretty good fist of it, many of them anyway, I must say. But the other side of the coin is that in the UK, we viciously hold down further education. We take it right out of prestige, adequate funding, everything else, and treat it very badly. And this is the English model. It's very class-based. You see a class society here in a way you don't see in California or even on the East Coast of the US. It's profound. And if bringing FE into higher education in a full sense is the big struggle now, I think, that creating a tertiary approach, which which blurs the boundaries again between FE and HE. But we're still going to have the hierarchy, and it's hard to work our way through that.
If I can, I know there's questions, but if I can just make up 2 points on that excellent discussion. I think one just difference here to Martin, your point on mimetic drift, is the CSU system was very adamant that they weren't engaging in mimesis right from the beginning, right from the 1960s. It was, we do award doctorates, but we're not trying to do research doctorates. They haven't, and I haven't even seen discourse actually, private or public, about wanting, for example, to award the doctorate in physics. It's never been about that. It's about having a separate identity that is focused on sort of professional and really teaching and other, really in the professions, right, quote unquote, in the professions and being elite or being a full university in that space. So I think there's some ways of disaggregating some of this mimesis. I'm not entirely sure it's mimesis per se in the way that or theorists and DiMaggio and Powell would sort of think about it. And the second point, just Simon, to your point on a class society, I think if we were to look, it may not be classed in exactly the same way, but I think California is far from being an egalitarian society, even in terms of access, right? Nominally, there is access, right, to community colleges for everyone, but those community colleges are not all born equal, and they're not funded equally, and so forth. And I won't get into all the issues here, but certainly I think the promise of equal access and the reality of equal access are sort of night and day.
Yep. Now, because you and I and Martin have had this interesting conversation, we've taken up lots of time, and so what I'm going to do is bring in the next 4 people on the call list and let them each ask their question, make their statement. So you'll be, I'm sorry, Amal, you'll be put under some pressure. You'll have to try and remember the 4. Take notes if you can, and respond to them all together. And that way we'll cover what have been good questions that have been waiting for a while. So it's going to be Aki, Leo, Astrid, Ludovic, and we'll take Aki first. Aki Yanazawa, please.
Thank you. The Martin already mentioned about the issue of the financial allocation that could be definitely the incentive in reality. But are there any evidence that the financial matters are told or discussed within the policy documents or as a kind of a clear incentive from the university state, California State University side? That is my question.
Is that My Neighbor Totoro in your background?
Yes, Totoro, yeah.
Fantastic film.
You know very well.
Should I answer, or should we get all 4?
No, we'll do
together?
the 4. Leo, you're next. Leo Van Cleef.
Yeah, thank you. Just one observation before I get to the question. I wonder, in the California context, if it's right to equate undergraduate access with doctoral access. That is, I don't think in that system people go straight up the chain the way they may in other places. Start out at your undergraduate institution, go straight through. So I think that's an important part if we look at the systems kind of approach there. But my question was, is the distinction between applied doctorates and research doctorates meaningful in your categorization? I think you touched on this a little bit already. Not all doctorates are equal. Thank you.
Thanks, Leo. Astrid Favela.
Yes, thank you so much for your great presentation. So my question was regarding the issue, your argument about identity recognition. Do you think this will encourage a sort of spillover effect for capacity building in other fields for awarding doctorates in CSUs? Thank you.
And the final questions from Ludovic Hyman.
Great, thanks, Simon. And thanks, Amal, for your great presentation. I guess you've answered quite a bit of my question already, but just generally, do you think these master plans or these plans made 50 years ago, do you think they're still fit for purpose with everything that's happened or happening in the world, and the pressures from you mentioned neoliberalism, massification, status, which comes through the research, and which the rankings capture only basically through the research? Do you think it's realistic to rely on these 50-year-old plans that were very prescriptive and really tried to, nail down institutions forever to a very specific role that obviously 50 years ago may no longer be adequate. So it's a long question, but basically are these plans fit for purpose 50 years later?
Right. So those 4 questions, Amal, so it's over to you. Take your time.
I will try to answer these in turn. So to Aki's question about financial incentives discussed in the policy questions, I think there certainly were financial incentives. I mean, part of what CSU faculty were fighting for were things like sabbaticals, research sabbaticals, and research leaves, and the ability to sort of hire and enroll graduate students, right, to help with their research. But it's a question about, I think, if I'm understanding your question right, I think the question is about, is the financial incentive primary and the status or sort of the identity question sort of a secondary, or is it the other way around? And my argument, and what I'm sort of seeing in the documents, is that it really was about because they started even in 1959. Right, even just before the master plan, they wanted that doctorate. And at that point, the finances of research sabbaticals and so forth weren't worked out in the ways that they were in the 1980s. So I think there were financial spillovers. I think someone used the word spillover, which I think is a good word. I think there were financial spillovers to claiming that identity or to having that identity be recognized, but I don't think it was a primary motivator, if that makes sense. Leo, to your question, I think the distinction between applied doctorates and research doctorates is meaningful, and I think there's work to be done. I don't do it just because of the limitations of what one can achieve in one paper. About again these sort of broader narratives of massification and sort of credentialing that happen in other fields, and it's arguable that that bifurcation between what is a research doctorate and what's an applied doctorate is one that will blur in the future. But it's very clear that the CSUs didn't want to go for the research doctorate. That's not how they saw their identity. What they wanted was sort of full recognition of doctoral education, which they were doing. But again, right from Glenn Dumke in 1963 to say, we want to do professional doctorates. And in fact, at that time, he was ridiculed for this notion of professional doctorates, right? That it was, what are professional doctorates? Those aren't real doctorates. How, a doctorate requires research and laboratories, and that's what a doctorate is. This professional doctorate is effectively nonsense. And I think we've come sort of a long way from there. So that's, I think, some context around that. Which gets to, I think, Astrid's point around awarding other doctorates and capacity building in other fields, which is, yeah, since the education doctorate, the CSU system has now been authorized to award the doctorate in physical therapy and in nursing practice, and I believe one more, which I can't quite remember, but that's also a professional sort of doctorate in allied, I think, in allied health fields, right, so forth. And that's, I think, where we'll continue to see that growth, and that again is a broader trend that we see across the world, really, right, about growth in sort of not the disciplines, but rather in the professions. And to Ludo's question, quite briefly, do master plans still fit the purpose? I think self-evidently no. I don't think master plans 50 years ago fit the purpose for the world has changed so much, right? I mean, it's hard to, one can think about the master plan as a quote unquote constitution, and then we can have debates about whether it's a living document or a document for, that needs to be interpreted in its original form. I think that's an interesting question to think about. But I could even argue that the master plan wasn't fit for purpose in 1960, right? For example, the master plan never talks about race. Race is just not a word that enters in the text of the master plan. And a part of that is just contextual, right? At that point, California was, I think, well over 90% white, right? And the demographics of California have changed so much over the last 50 years, as have, in many states and almost, many countries. And so the question is, but even in 1960, promise of the master plan didn't quite meet its reality, right, for students, and particularly for students of color. And I think one has to interrogate the master plan more, I think, as a political consensus, right? And Simon, I know you've sort of done some of this to stave off legislative intervention in the UC's affairs, rather than as a planning document for the state, with principles of equity and access in mind. Certainly it had that rhetoric, but I'm not sure it had that intent, if that makes sense. And there's a subtle but important difference between those.
And yet another example of how race is not contained entirely by class. What really changed in California was the racial composition and the entry of Mexican immigrants, especially in large numbers, and the white middle class wouldn't fund their education anymore. It was prepared to fund, to a degree, the access of the white working class, but not the access of others, of non-whites. And gee, how important that is in the US, but perhaps everywhere, and certainly in the UK as well. And I mean, it's I think we're having this discussion now about race in ways which allow it to be separated to some extent from the dynamics of class and the expectations of social democracy. And I think that's been really helpful because, if there's anything that scuttled the kind of the egalitarian intent of the master plan, that's what it was. We want to thank you sincerely, but I think we'll take one more question. We usually go to about 5 past. Can you hang in there?
Yeah, I have time.
I know you must be about ready for an early breakfast, but Zach Spire is our final question. Zach, you ran a risk coming in at 8 minutes to the hour, but we'll let you in anyway.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon, and thanks, Amal. Great presentation. Good morning from Stanford. My question focuses on your point about the planning and the system and the sort of disaggregation of prestige and economic pursuits, etc. And I guess the question that out of what you just stated coming out is what would you see as, if you will, the threat now to the UC or the CSUs if there's no more planning, if there's no plan and the plan is no longer fit for purpose? What's the new plan? What do you suggest is the new plan? Because as someone who was educated in the UCs and now works in a large research institution, I'm curious about how you bevel the edges of what I see as the differences in financing and prestige, and that sort of repetition really just being sustained.
Yeah, thanks. I think actually I'll answer that. I think there's 2 different questions you're asking there. One is, and one question is, what is the threat to the UCs? I actually think the elites benefit from there being no plan, because the status quo is very much tilted to their interests. So I think to your point, right, like the inequities in financing and so forth, right, the UCs would very much prefer that there be no plan. That said, I just don't, as I said earlier, I just don't think we could get, is it even possible to get 5 politicians in a room today and get them to agree that the sun rises in the east? I'm not entirely convinced of that. And so trying to sort out what a new master plan for California would be, I think, just, even if necessary, politically unfeasible. I think the work that's happening in particular around things like community college baccalaureates are beginning to round off those edges and blur the distinction. I mean, a part of the issue was these sharp tripartite divisions that the master plan made, right? And I can have a full other talk about the top 12.5% and the 33% and how setting those up gave effectively administrators a rationale for excluding students of color and excluding low-income students who weren't quote unquote prepared, and funneling them into community colleges, which very quickly became oversubscribed and underfunded, especially after Proposition 13, right, which took away local funding. All of these are details which are important, but quite granular. So I think some of the questions about blurring those distinctions between community colleges and the UCs and the CSUs can sort of go that route. And I ask, one question that may be provocative in this question is, why are there UCs and CSUs, right? And what do we gain from having a sharp differentiation of mission? right? And maybe there is something we gain. There's certainly a lot that we gain in terms of efficiency, but what do we give up in terms of equity, right? And how does one make those trade-offs between efficiency and equity in this context? And maybe I'll leave it there as a provocation.
Well, I think you were thinking courts of my own at the end of the work I did in 2016 on the same problem. Yeah, blur that distinction and blur the other one as well. And 2-year degrees no longer cut it. You need 3 years or 4 years really in the labour market and as a form of educational preparation. So yeah, blur the boundaries. Amal, I want to thank you. I thought that was really brilliantly done, and you're a very good presenter, and but also the engagement with the discussion was excellent as well. So feel free to come back onto our show again and talk to our global audience. I wish you all the best in the next stages of your career, and higher education. The journal would be interested in publishing anything that you're preparing, folks. We've got an exciting webinar coming up next Tuesday. We're back with the broad topic of the geopolitics of international higher education. And we've got Emma Zablizaliva coming back from UNESCO now, as she is. And also Lisa Brunner and Adam Grimm from Michigan State talking to us about geopolitics. And I suppose the really exciting question is whether Aki Yanazawa will still be with his My Neighbor Totoro background, or will have switched to Kiki's delivery service, Spirited Away, Nausicaa, maybe Murmur of the Heart, not 100% Miyazaki, but a really good film nonetheless. Looking forward to seeing you checking out Aki's background and Emma and Lisa and Adam next Tuesday on the CGHE webinar. And once again, Amal, thank you very much for joining us today. It was a great presentation. Bye for now.
Thank you.